What would you do if your wife demanded half of your $10 billion fortune in a divorce? But legally, you didn't own a single penny of it. My name is Jonathan Pierce, and this is the story of how my mother's brilliant strategy protected me from the ultimate betrayal. If you think you know how this ends, think again. But before we dive into this incredible journey, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one will completely change how you think about love, money, and trust. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors that Cassandra had insisted we install 3 years ago. I stood there, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up below me, unaware that this would be one of the last mornings I'd spend in this home as a married man. My name is Jonathan Pierce, and at 45, I've built something most people only dream of: a global empire worth over $10 billion. Pierce Industries started as a small tech consulting firm in my garage 23 years ago, and through relentless work, strategic acquisitions, and perhaps a bit of luck, it grew into a conglomerate spanning real estate, technology, renewable energy, and pharmaceuticals. But success, I've learned, comes with a price that extends far beyond the long hours and sleepless nights. Jonathan, we need to talk. Cassandra's voice cut through my morning contemplation like a blade. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, her auburn hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her green eyes holding that familiar coldness that had become her trademark over the past 2 years. "Good morning to you too, Cass," I replied, forcing a smile. "Coffee?" She waved dismissively. "I don't have time for pleasantries. I've made a decision." My heart sank, though I tried to maintain my composure. "What kind of decision?" "I want a divorce." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Though I'd seen this coming for months, maybe even years, hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow to my chest. "Cassandra, can we please sit down and talk about this? Whatever's wrong, we can work through it." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Work through it? Jonathan, you're never here. When you are here, you're on your phone or locked in your study. I married a man, not a corporation. Everything I do for us. For our future." "Our future?" She stepped closer, her voice rising. "What future? We don't even have children because you're too busy building your empire to build a family. I'm 38 years old, Jonathan. I've wasted the best years of my life waiting for you to remember that you have a wife." The accusation stung because there was truth in it. I had been consumed by work, driven by a need to prove myself that went deeper than mere ambition. But what Cassandra didn't understand, what she'd never understood, was why I pushed myself so hard. "I know I've been absent," I began, but nothing. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. David Blackwood comes highly recommended for high-net-worth divorces. He assures me this will be straightforward. California is a community property state, after all." The way she said it, with such casual calculation, made my blood run cold. This wasn't a woman devastated by the end of her marriage. This was someone who had done her homework and was ready to cash out. "Cassandra, is this really about my work schedule, or is this about the money?" Her eyes flashed dangerously. "How dare you suggest that I'm some kind of gold digger? I fell in love with you when you were just starting out, remember?" She was right about that. We'd met 12 years ago at a charity gala. I was 33, she was 26, and Pierce Industries was just beginning to show real promise. She was working as an event coordinator then, beautiful and charming, with dreams of starting her own luxury event planning business. "I remember," I said softly. "I remember everything about that night. You were wearing a black dress with silver beading, and you laughed at my terrible jokes about quantum computing." For just a moment, her expression softened, and I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "That was a long time ago, Jonathan. People change." "Yes," I agreed quietly. "They do." After she left for her yoga class, a routine that had become sacred to her over the past year, I sat alone in our kitchen, staring at the divorce papers she'd left on the granite countertop. The letterhead read Blackwood, Sterling and Associates, in elegant script. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized but hoped never to use. "Pierce Residence." The familiar voice of Mrs. Henderson, my mother's housekeeper, answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Henderson, it's Jonathan. Is my mother available?" Of course, dear. Let me get her for you. While I waited, I walked to the window and looked out at Central Park. Joggers were making their morning rounds, children were heading to school with their nannies, and life continued its relentless forward march, indifferent to the personal dramas playing out in the apartments and penthouses above. Jonathan, my mother's voice was warm but concerned. At 72, Evelyn Pierce still possessed the sharp intellect and gentle wisdom that had guided me through every major decision in my life. Mom, I need to see you. It's important. Is everything all right? You sound troubled. Cassandra wants a divorce. There was a pause, and I could almost see my mother's face, the way her brow would furrow with that mixture of sadness and determination that had carried our family through countless challenges. I'll have Mrs. Henderson prepare lunch. Can you be here by noon? Yes. And Mom? Yes, dear? Thank you. For everything. We'll talk when you get here. 2. My mother's estate in the Hamptons had always been my sanctuary. Situated on 12 acres of pristine waterfront property, the Georgian-style mansion had been in our family for 3 generations. As I drove through the iron gates and up the tree-lined driveway, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Evelyn Pierce was waiting for me on the front steps, looking every inch the matriarch she was. Her silver hair was pulled back in her signature chignon, and she wore a simple but elegant navy dress that somehow made her appear both approachable and formidable. "My boy," she said, embracing me with the fierce love that only a mother can provide. "You look tired." "I feel tired, Mom." She linked her arm through mine and led me into the house. The interior hadn't changed much since my childhood. Antique furniture that told stories, family portraits that chronicled our history, and the subtle scent of lavender that somehow always lingered in the air. We settled in the sunroom overlooking the garden, where Mrs. Henderson had prepared a simple lunch of soup and sandwiches. For a few minutes, we ate in comfortable silence, the way families do when words aren't necessary. "Tell me what happened," my mother finally said. I recounted the morning's conversation, trying to be fair to both. Cassandra and myself, though the hurt in my voice was impossible to hide. "She's hired David Blackwood," I concluded. "Apparently, he specializes in high-net-worth divorces." My mother set down her teacup with a gentle clink. "I see. And what did you tell her about our arrangement?" "Nothing. She doesn't know. 23 years ago, when I was just starting Pierce Industries, my mother had made me a proposition that seemed almost absurd at the time. She wanted to be the legal owner of everything I built. 'Son,' she had said, 'success will bring you many things, but it will also bring you people who want to take what you've earned. If you build your fortune in your own name, you'll spend your life wondering who loves you and who loves your money.'" I had protested, naturally. What 22-year-old wants to admit that his mother might know better? But Evelyn Pierce had lived through my father's death when I was 16, had seen how quickly supposed friends and business partners had disappeared when the money became uncertain. "Trust is the most precious commodity you'll ever possess," she had continued. "If you place everything in my name, anyone who marries you will do so believing they're marrying a man of modest means. Only those who love you for who you are will stay." It had seemed overly cautious then. Now, staring at divorce papers that assumed I owned billions in assets that legally belonged to my mother, her wisdom seemed almost prophetic. "Do you regret it?" she asked gently. I considered the question carefully. "I don't know. Part of me wonders if Cassandra would have been different if she'd known the truth from the beginning." "Would you have wanted her to be?" It was a fair point. If Cassandra had known about the fortune and treated me differently because of it, would that have been love or performance? "There's something else," I said, pulling out my phone and showing her a text message I'd received an hour ago. It was from Cassandra. "David says we should be able to wrap this up quickly. Half of everything plus spousal support should set me up quite nicely. Maybe you'll learn to appreciate what you had." My mother read the message twice, her expression growing stern. "I see. So this isn't just about being neglected. This is about what she expects to gain." "It seems that way." She stood and walked to the window, her hands clasped behind her back in a pose that reminded me of my grandmother. "Jonathan, I want you to know that everything I've done has been to protect you. But that protection comes with responsibility." "What do you mean?" She turned back to me, her blue eyes intense. "If we reveal the truth about the assets now, it will look like we've been deliberately deceptive. Cassandra could claim fraud, argue that she was misled about your financial situation when she married you. My stomach dropped. Are you saying we can't use the arrangement to protect the assets? I'm saying we need to be very careful about how we handle this. We need the best legal representation available, and we need to be prepared for this to get ugly. She walked to an antique secretary desk and pulled out a leather-bound address book that looked like it belonged in a museum. I'm going to call Margaret Chen. She handled your father's estate, and she's been our family attorney for 30 years. If anyone can navigate this situation, it's her. As my mother made the call, I wandered through the house, looking at the family photos that chronicled our history. There was my father, tall and handsome in his Navy uniform. There was my graduation from Stanford. There were pictures from my wedding to Cassandra, both of us smiling and radiant, believing in a future that now seemed like a fantasy. Margaret can see us tomorrow morning, my mother announced when she returned. She's going to review all the documentation tonight. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Always. Do you think I'm a bad husband? She sat down beside me and took my hands in hers. I think you're a man who was raised to believe that providing for his family was the highest expression of love. Your father worked 16-hour days to build the foundation that allowed you to succeed. But times have changed, and perhaps the definition of what it means to be a good husband has changed too. Cassandra says I chose work over her. Did you? The question hung between us like a challenge. I thought I was working for us, for our future children, for security. But did she feel loved? It was a question I couldn't answer, and my silence was answer enough. Jonathan, there's a difference between being loved and feeling loved. You may have loved Cassandra with every fiber of your being, but if she didn't feel that love in the ways she needed to feel it, then from her perspective, she wasn't truly loved at all. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the gardens that had been my playground as a child. My mother told me stories I'd forgotten, reminded me of dreams I'd abandoned, and helped me remember who I was before I became obsessed with what I could achieve. Whatever happens with this divorce, she said as we watched the sun set over the water, I want you to remember something. Your worth as a man isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the success of your business. It's measured by how you treat people, how you handle adversity, and whether you can look at yourself in the mirror with dignity. Even if I lose everything? She smiled, and for a moment, I was 8 years old again, seeking comfort after a nightmare. You can't lose everything that matters, because the things that truly matter can't be taken away. They can only be given away. As I drove back to Manhattan that night, I felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever was coming, whatever Cassandra and her lawyers had planned, I wouldn't face it alone. I had something that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet or divided by a court order. I had family. I had truth. And I had the wisdom of a woman who had spent her entire life protecting what mattered most. 3. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in how quickly a life can unravel. Cassandra had moved out of the penthouse and into a luxury hotel suite on the Upper East Side. To give us both space to think, she'd said, though her Instagram posts from exclusive restaurants and shopping trips suggested she was enjoying her freedom. Meanwhile, David Blackwood had wasted no time in making his presence known. The man was everything I'd expected from Cassandra's description. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of practiced charm that made wealthy women feel understood and validated. He'd sent several letters to my business attorney, each one more aggressive than the last. They're moving fast, Margaret Chen observed during our second meeting in her Madison Avenue office. At 68, Margaret was a formidable woman who had built her career on discretion and results. Her office reflected both qualities, understated. Elegance with just enough legal awards and prestigious client photos to remind visitors that they were in the presence of someone who got things done. How fast? I asked. They've already filed for divorce and requested immediate disclosure of all assets. They want financial statements going back 10 years, business valuations, real estate appraisals, and investment portfolio details. My mother, who had insisted on attending every meeting, leaned forward in her chair. And what happens when they discover that Jonathan doesn't own any of it? That's where things get complicated, Margaret said, removing her glasses and cleaning them with practiced precision. The fact that the assets are legally held in Evelyn's name will certainly come as a shock to them. But they'll argue that it's a sham arrangement designed to hide marital assets. Is it? I asked. Legally, I mean? No. The arrangement was put in place long before Jonathan met Cassandra, and it was done for legitimate estate planning and asset protection purposes. However, the appearance could be problematic. She pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across her desk. I've been reviewing the corporate structures, trust documents, and financial records. Everything is legally sound, but perception matters in divorce proceedings. What's our strategy? My mother asked. Margaret's expression grew serious. We have two options. Option 1. We reveal the arrangement immediately and let them adapt their strategy accordingly. This has the advantage of honesty, but opens us up to claims of fraud and concealment. And option 2? We let them proceed with their asset discovery and respond truthfully to their requests. When they ask Jonathan to list his assets, he'll list what he actually owns, which is relatively modest. The burden will be on them to prove he owns more than he claims. I felt a chill run down my spine. That sounds like we're setting a trap. We're simply responding honestly to their inquiries. If they've made assumptions about Jonathan's wealth without doing proper due diligence, that's not our responsibility. Over the following days, I found myself living in a strange limbo. Cassandra and I barely spoke, communicating mainly through lawyers and the occasional terse text message. She had returned to the penthouse a few times to collect her belongings, but we managed to avoid each other during these visits. The silence gave me time to think, and what I thought about most was how we'd gotten to this point. When had our conversations stopped being about dreams and started being about money? When had she stopped looking at me with love and started looking at me with calculation? I remembered our 5th anniversary dinner, 3 years ago. We'd gone to Le Bernardin, her favorite restaurant, and she'd spent the entire evening talking about her friend Monica's divorce settlement. Can you believe she got $12 million? Cassandra had said, her eyes bright with something that wasn't quite admiration. Monica says it's because her husband tried to hide assets in offshore accounts. The judge was so angry about the deception that he awarded her extra. At the time, I'd attributed her interest to simple gossip. Now, I wondered if it had been research. The text messages had become increasingly pointed too. Just yesterday, she'd sent me a photo of herself at Tiffany & Company with the caption, "Treating myself to something nice before I have to pretend to be poor again." But it was the conversation I'd overheard at a charity gala the previous month that really opened my eyes. I'd been in the men's room when I heard Cassandra's distinctive laugh coming from the hallway. "Oh, please," she was saying to someone. "Jonathan is worth at least $10 billion. Pierce Industries alone is worth more than most small countries. When we divorce, I'll be set for life." "You're really going through with it?" another woman's voice had asked. "Absolutely. I've given him 12 years. That's worth at least $5 billion, don't you think?" The casual way she discussed the end of our marriage like a business transaction had left me feeling sick. But it had also clarified something important. This wasn't about love lost or needs unmet. This was about opportunity recognized. My phone buzzed with another message from her. "David says you're being uncooperative with the asset disclosure. Stop playing games, Jonathan. We both know what you're worth." I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "I'm cooperating fully. I've provided everything requested." Her response was immediate. "Don't insult my intelligence. Your financial disclosure shows assets of less than $2 million. We both know that's ridiculous." She wasn't wrong. The financial statement I'd submitted, prepared under Margaret's guidance, listed my personal checking and savings accounts, my 401k, some stock options, and the modest trust fund my grandfather had left me. By any normal standard, it represented a comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle. Of course, what it didn't show was that I lived in a penthouse owned by Pierce Holdings LLC, which was owned by my mother. It didn't show that I drove cars registered to Evelyn Pierce. It didn't show that my mother paid for our vacations, our club memberships, and most of our entertainment expenses. On paper, I looked like a well-paid executive with good saving habits. In reality, I lived like a billionaire because a billionaire, my mother, chose to share her wealth with me. "This is going to get ugly," I told Margaret during our phone call that afternoon. It already has, she replied. Blackwood called this morning. He's threatening to subpoena your business records and demand depositions from your key employees. He thinks you're hiding assets in the corporate structure. Let him look. He won't find anything because there's nothing to find. Jonathan, I need you to understand something. When Blackwood realizes that your mother legally owns everything, his next move will be to argue that she's simply holding assets in trust for you. He'll claim that the arrangement is a fraudulent conveyance designed to cheat Cassandra out of her marital rights. Can he prove that? Probably not, given the timeline and documentation. But he can make our lives very difficult in the process. And there's another concern. What? If this goes to trial, it will become public record. The media will have a field day with the story of a billionaire who hid his fortune from his wife. It could damage both your business reputation and your personal relationships. That evening, I drove out to the Hamptons again. I needed my mother's counsel, but more than that, I needed the peace that seemed to exist only in that house by the water. I found her in the library, reading by the fireplace with a cup of tea and her cat, Winston, curled up on her lap. She looked up when I entered, and I could see the worry in her eyes. It's getting worse, isn't it? I told her about Blackwood's threats and Margaret's concerns about media attention. She listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. I'm sorry, Mom. I never wanted to drag you into this mess. She set down her book and looked at me with the steady gaze that had guided me through every crisis of my life. Jonathan, do you remember what I told you when your father died? I thought back to that terrible day when I was 16 and the world had seemed to collapse around us. You said that we would face the storm together and that we would emerge stronger on the other side. That's right. And we did, didn't we? Yes. This is just another storm, my dear. Different from the others. Perhaps more painful because it involves betrayal rather than tragedy. But we'll face it together and we'll emerge stronger. She stood up, causing Winston to protest with an indignant meow, and walked to the window overlooking the garden. There's something I need to tell you, something I probably should have said years ago. What? I never liked Cassandra. The admission surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. My mother was unfailingly polite to everyone, but now that I thought about it, she had always been somewhat reserved around my wife. Why didn't you say anything? Because you were happy, or at least you seemed to be. And because I hoped I was wrong about her. She turned back to me, her expression sad but determined. But I wasn't wrong, was I? No, I admitted. You weren't wrong. A mother knows, Jonathan. Not always, but usually. I saw how she looked at things, the house, the cars, the jewelry. She never looked at you the way she looked at the things you could provide. Then why didn't you warn me? She smiled sadly. Because sometimes we have to learn difficult lessons for ourselves. If I had told you my concerns, you might have dismissed them as a meddling mother-in-law. Now you know the truth because you've seen it with your own eyes. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, she spoke again. There's something else you need to know. If this arrangement I created to protect you ends up causing you pain instead, I'll dissolve it immediately. I'll transfer everything back to you, regardless of the financial consequences. Mom, no. You can't do that. The tax implications alone would be devastating. Money isn't worth my son's happiness. And my happiness isn't worth destroying everything we've built together. She smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached her eyes. Then we're in agreement. We see this through together, whatever the cost. As I drove back to the city that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The absolute certainty that someone loved me unconditionally. Not for what I could provide or what I could achieve, but simply for who I was. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats from Blackwood, and new tests of our resolve. But tonight, I knew I wasn't facing them alone. 4. The deposition was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a gray Tuesday in November. Blackwood had chosen his firm's conference room on the 42nd floor of a midtown tower, probably to intimidate me with the commanding view of the city that my empire supposedly dominated. I arrived with Margaret, both of us dressed in conservative business attire that projected competence without ostentation. Cassandra was already there, sitting beside Blackwood at the far end of a conference table that could have seated 20 people. She looked different than I remembered, thinner, her makeup more dramatic, her clothing more expensive. The woman I'd married had favored simple elegance. This version of her seemed designed to catch attention. "Good morning, Cassandra," I said politely. She barely acknowledged me, instead whispering something to Blackwood that made him smile coldly. "Mr. Pierce," Blackwood said, rising to shake my hand with the kind of firm grip that was meant to establish dominance. "Thank you for coming. I trust we can clear up these asset disclosure issues quickly." "I'm happy to answer any questions you have," I replied. The court reporter was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who seemed to have seen enough of these proceedings to maintain a professional detachment from the drama unfolding around her. Blackwood began with routine questions: my name, address, occupation, how long I'd been married to Cassandra. But I could see him building toward something, the way a prosecutor constructs a case piece by piece. "Mr. Pierce, you founded Pierce Industries in 2001, is that correct?" "Yes. And today, Pierce Industries is worth approximately how much?" Margaret placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Objection. My client's personal assets are not the same as the corporate valuation of Pierce Industries." "I'll rephrase," Blackwood said smoothly. "Mr. Pierce, what is your ownership stake in Pierce Industries?" I had been dreading this question, but Margaret and I had prepared for it. "I am the founder and CEO of Pierce Industries, but I don't own any shares in the company." For the first time since we'd begun, Blackwood looked genuinely surprised. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "I don't own any shares in Pierce Industries." Cassandra's head snapped up, and I saw confusion and alarm flash across her face. This clearly wasn't what she'd expected to hear. "Mr. Pierce, are you telling me that you founded a company worth billions of dollars and don't own any part of it?" "That's correct." "Then who does own it?" I looked at Margaret, who nodded slightly. "Pierce Industries is owned by Pierce Holdings LLC, which is owned by my mother, Evelyn Pierce." The silence that followed was deafening. I could actually hear the traffic noise from the street 42 floors below us. Cassandra was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Equal parts shock, rage, and something that looked like fear. "Your mother owns your company?" Blackwood's voice had lost its confident tone. "Yes." "What about Pierce Real Estate Holdings?" "Also owned by my mother." "Pierce Renewable Energy?" "My mother." "The pharmaceutical division?" "My mother." With each answer, I watched Blackwood's case crumble in real time. He began flipping through papers frantically, clearly looking for something that would contradict what I was telling him. "Mr. Pierce, do you own any real estate?" "No." "The penthouse on Central Park West where you and Mrs. Pierce resided?" "Owned by Pierce Holdings LLC, which is owned by my mother." "The house in the Hamptons?" "That's been in my family for 3 generations. It's owned by my mother." "Vehicles?" "Registered to my mother." Cassandra finally found her voice. "This is impossible, Jonathan. You're lying." Margaret intervened smoothly. "Mrs. Pierce, please direct your questions through your attorney." Blackwood had regained some of his composure, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "Mr. Pierce, this arrangement with your mother, when was it established?" "The initial corporate structure was put in place in 2001, when I founded the company. The real estate and other assets were transferred to her name over the years as the business grew." "All before you married Mrs. Pierce?" "Yes. Cassandra and I married in 2012. The asset protection structure was fully in place by 2010. "I see." Blackwood made several notes on his legal pad. "And why did you establish this unusual arrangement?" I had practiced this answer many times. "Estate planning and asset protection. My mother is a sophisticated investor who wanted to ensure the family wealth was properly structured for tax efficiency and protection from potential business liabilities." "Mr. Pierce, isn't it true that this arrangement was designed to defraud future creditors and spouses?" Margaret stood up. "Objection. That's argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence." "I'll withdraw the question," Blackwood said. "Mr. Pierce, what is your annual income?" "I receive a salary of $200,000 per year as CEO of Pierce Industries, plus performance bonuses that vary year to year." "And last year's bonus?" $50,000. I could see Cassandra doing quick math in her head, and the color was draining from her face. $250,000 per year was a good income, but it wasn't billionaire money. It wouldn't support the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to, and it certainly wouldn't fund the kind of divorce settlement she'd been expecting. Mr. Pierce, do you have access to your mother's wealth? She's generous with her family, yes. How generous? She pays for vacations, dinners, entertainment. She allows me to live in properties she owns and use vehicles she owns. Would you say she supports your lifestyle? I would say she's a loving mother who shares her good fortune with her son. Blackwood tried several more approaches, but each one led to the same result. Every asset he inquired about, every source of wealth he attempted to identify, traced back to Evelyn Pierce. By the time we broke for lunch, his confidence had completely evaporated. During the break, I could hear raised voices coming from the conference room where Cassandra and Blackwood were meeting privately. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably angry and desperate. When we reconvened, Blackwood had a new strategy. Mr. Pierce, isn't it true that this arrangement with your mother is simply a shell game designed to hide your assets? No, it's not. Isn't it true that you control your mother's financial decisions? Absolutely not. My mother is a brilliant businesswoman who makes her own investment decisions. But you advise her? Sometimes she asks for my opinion, just as any family member might. And doesn't she always follow your advice? This was dangerous territory. If I admitted to controlling my mother's decisions, it would support his argument that the assets were really mine. But if I claimed to have no influence, it might seem unbelievable given my role as CEO. My mother has her own investment advisors and makes her own decisions. Sometimes she agrees with my recommendations, sometimes she doesn't. Can you give me an example of a time when she disagreed with your recommendation? I thought carefully. Last year, I recommended that we sell our stake in a biotech startup that was struggling. She disagreed and wanted to hold the investment. 6 months later, the company announced a major breakthrough and the value tripled. So she's actually a better investor than you are? In many ways, yes. It was true, and I think Blackwood could hear the sincerity in my voice. My mother had always had an intuitive understanding of markets and people that complemented my more analytical approach. The success of our family fortune was as much due to her judgment as to my execution. The deposition continued for 3 more hours, but Blackwood never recovered his momentum. By the time we concluded, he looked like a man who had prepared for one battle and found himself fighting an entirely different war. "This isn't over," Cassandra said to me as we were leaving. It was the first time she'd spoken directly to me all day. "I never wanted it to begin," I replied. That evening, Margaret called me at home. "How do you think it went?" "Better than I expected." Blackwood seemed genuinely surprised. He was. "I think they really believed you owned everything personally. Now they're going to have to completely restructure their approach." "What's next?" "They'll probably demand depositions from your mother and your key business associates. They'll want to see contracts, corporate documents, anything that might suggest you have more control over the assets than you've admitted. Let them look. The documentation will support everything I said today." "Jonathan, there's something else we need to discuss. I've been thinking about their next move, and I believe they're going to argue that your mother is holding assets in trust for you, even if that trust isn't formalized in writing. Can they prove that? Maybe not in court, but they can create enough doubt to make this process very expensive and very public. Are you prepared for that?" I looked around the penthouse that had been my home for 8 years, at the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, at the life I'd built that was about to be torn apart and examined piece by piece. I'm prepared for whatever comes next. But even as I said the words, I wondered if they were true. 5. The second deposition was scheduled for the following week, this time with my mother as the witness. I had offered to prepare her, to review potential questions and develop strategies for her answers. But Evelyn Pierce had declined with the kind of quiet confidence that had guided her through 7 decades of challenges. "I'll simply tell the truth, dear," she had said when I called to discuss it. The truth has served me well so far. The setting was the same intimidating conference room, but the atmosphere was entirely different. My mother arrived precisely on time, dressed in a navy suit that managed to be both modest and elegant. She carried herself with the kind of natural dignity that money can't buy and breeding rarely achieves, and I could see that even Blackwood was slightly off balance in her presence. "Mrs. Pierce," he began, after the usual preliminaries, You understand that we're here to discuss your ownership of various assets that your son has used during his marriage? I understand that you're trying to determine what belongs to whom, she replied evenly. I'm happy to clarify that for you. Blackwood had clearly done his homework this time. He began with specific questions about corporate ownership, purchase dates, and financial transactions. My mother answered each one with precision, occasionally referring to a leather portfolio she had brought with her. Mrs. Pierce, Pierce Industries was founded by your son in 2001. Why did you choose to be the legal owner rather than allowing him to own his own company? My mother set down her reading glasses and looked directly at Blackwood with the kind of steady gaze that had intimidated CEOs and charmed diplomats. Mr. Blackwood, have you ever lost a husband? The question clearly wasn't what he had expected. No, ma'am, I haven't. I lost my husband when Jonathan was 16 years old. Robert Pierce was a brilliant man who built a successful investment firm. But when he died, I learned some very hard lessons about loyalty, friendship, and human nature. She paused, and I could see Cassandra shifting uncomfortably in her chair. Within 6 months of Robert's death, business partners who had called him their closest friend were fighting over contracts. Employees who had sworn their loyalty were stealing clients. Even some people I had considered family friends suddenly became very interested in how much money I might have and whether I needed help managing it. Blackwood tried to interrupt. Mrs. Pierce, while I'm sorry for your loss, I don't see how. I'm explaining why the arrangement exists, my mother continued calmly. When Jonathan started his company, I had already learned that money changes everything. It changes how people see you, how they treat you, and most importantly, how you can never be certain whether their feelings for you are genuine. She opened her portfolio and removed a document. This is a letter I wrote to Jonathan on his 22nd birthday, before he had achieved any success, before he had met Cassandra, before anyone could have known what Pierce Industries would become. In it, I offered to be the legal owner of whatever he might build, not to control it, but to protect him from the very situation we find ourselves in today. Blackwood examined the letter, his expression growing more frustrated by the minute. Mrs. Pierce, regardless of your motivations, isn't it true that this arrangement gives your son access to billions of dollars while allowing him to appear financially modest? Mr. Blackwood, if your mother owned a house, would you expect her to charge you rent when you visited? That's not the same thing, isn't it? Jonathan is my son. Everything I have will be his someday anyway. Why should I force him to live like a pauper while I'm alive simply to satisfy some arbitrary definition of ownership? Cassandra finally spoke up, her voice sharp with frustration. Mrs. Pierce, with all due respect, your son led me to believe he was successful in his own right. My mother turned to Cassandra with the kind of look that could freeze water. And wasn't he? Do you think Pierce Industries built itself? Do you think the 12-hour days and sleepless nights were imaginary? Do you think the intelligence and dedication required to manage a global corporation are somehow less valuable because I hold the legal title? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean, dear? The endearment was delivered with such cold politeness that it felt like a slap. Cassandra's face flushed red. I meant that I made decisions about my future based on what I thought our financial situation was. And what decisions were those? Margaret placed a warning hand on my arm, sensing that this exchange was moving into dangerous territory for Cassandra, but I wanted to hear her answer. I chose not to pursue my own career as aggressively as I might have. I assumed that Jonathan's success would provide financial security for both of us. My mother nodded thoughtfully. I see. So you gave up your own ambitions in order to benefit from his. I supported his career. How? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cassandra looked to Blackwood for help, but he was smart enough to stay out of this particular exchange. I managed our social obligations. I entertained clients. I represented the company at events. Did Jonathan ask you to do those things? Well, no, but did he prevent you from pursuing your own career? He was never home. How could I build a business when I was always alone? Mrs. Pierce, my mother said gently, many women have built successful careers while their husbands traveled for work. Many women have managed to pursue their dreams without abandoning them for the promise of financial security. The choice to depend on someone else's success rather than creating your own is just that, a choice. I had never loved my mother more than I did in that moment. With quiet dignity and devastating logic, she had exposed the fundamental selfishness of Cassandra's position without raising her voice or losing her composure. Blackwood tried to regain control of the questioning. Mrs. Pierce, let's return to the specific assets. The penthouse on Central Park West. When did you purchase that property? 2015. And the purchase price? $12 million. Did you consult with your son before making this purchase? Of course. He and Cassandra were going to live there. So the decision was made for his benefit? The decision was made for his comfort and happiness, yes. Just as any parent might choose to help their child. But this wasn't a gift. The property remains in your name. Mr. Blackwood, if you had a son and the means to provide him with a beautiful home, would you insist that he pay rent, or would you share your good fortune with him? That's not the point, Mrs. Pierce. I think it's exactly the point. Blackwood tried a different approach. Mrs. Pierce, your son receives a salary of only $250,000 per year from Pierce Industries. Surely that's insufficient to maintain the lifestyle he and Mrs. Pierce enjoyed during their marriage. It would be, if that were all the money available to them. So you supplement his income? I share my wealth with my family. Is that illegal? It's not illegal, but it does raise questions about whether this arrangement is genuine or simply a way to hide assets. My mother leaned forward slightly, and her voice took on a steel edge that I recognized from my childhood. The tone she used when someone had pushed too far. Mr. Blackwood, I am 72 years old. I have survived the death of my husband, raised a son, built and maintained a fortune that spans 3 generations, and navigated more legal and financial challenges than you've probably encountered in your entire career. Do you really think I need to hide anything from you? Mrs. Pierce, I'm not questioning your intelligence or experience. Yes, you are. You're suggesting that I'm either incompetent enough to be manipulated by my son or dishonest enough to participate in fraud. Which is it? The room fell silent. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine, sensing that something significant was happening. Blackwood had clearly underestimated my mother, and now he was paying the price. Mrs. Pierce, I apologize if I've given that impression. Apology accepted. Now, shall we continue with questions about facts rather than speculation about my character? The rest of the deposition proceeded more smoothly, with Blackwood sticking to specific questions about assets and ownership. My mother answered each one with the precision of someone who understood her own financial affairs completely. When it was over, Cassandra approached us as we were leaving. Mrs. Pierce, I hope you understand that this isn't personal. My mother stopped and turned to face her former daughter-in-law. My dear, everything about marriage is personal. Everything about divorce is personal. Everything about trying to claim half of someone else's life's work is deeply, intensely personal. I'm entitled to half of what was built during our marriage. Are you? What did you build, Cassandra? What did you create? What value did you add that entitles you to? Billions of dollars. I was his wife. Yes, you were. And in return for that role, you lived in luxury, traveled the world, wore designer clothes, ate at the finest restaurants, and wanted for nothing. If that wasn't payment enough for being Jonathan's wife, then perhaps you chose the wrong husband. With that, my mother took my arm and walked toward the elevators, leaving Cassandra standing in the hallway with her mouth open. Mom, I said as we waited for the elevator, that was incredible. That was necessary, she replied. Some people only understand strength, and that woman needed to understand exactly who she was dealing with. As we rode down to the lobby, I realized that I had just witnessed a masterclass in dignity, intelligence, and quiet power. My mother hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lost her temper, and hadn't said anything that wasn't absolutely true. But she had systematically dismantled every assumption underlying Cassandra's case. What happens now? I asked as we walked out into the crisp November air. Now we wait to see if they're smart enough to realize they've lost. That evening, Margaret called with an update. Blackwood wants to meet tomorrow. He says his client is interested in discussing a settlement. What kind of settlement? He didn't specify, but I suspect they're going to try to negotiate for a fraction of what they originally hoped for. And if we refuse? Then we go to trial, and everything becomes public record. The media will have a field day with this story. I looked around the penthouse that had been my home for 8 years, at the city lights that had witnessed my triumphs and failures, at the life I had built that was about to change forever. "Set up the meeting," I said. "Let's see what they have to say." 6. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday in Margaret's office, neutral territory that might encourage more reasonable discussion. I arrived early, wanting a few minutes to prepare mentally for what would likely be the final negotiation of my marriage. Margaret's office had been transformed into a conference room for the occasion, with a large table surrounded by leather chairs and several easels holding flip charts covered with financial projections. It looked more like a corporate merger discussion than a divorce settlement, which I supposed was appropriate given the amounts involved. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret asked as we reviewed our talking points one final time. "As ready as I'll ever be." Blackwood arrived precisely on time, followed by Cassandra and a younger associate who looked fresh out of law school. Cassandra had clearly made an effort with her appearance. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup subtle but elegant, and she wore a conservative black dress that projected both sophistication and vulnerability. "Jonathan," she said softly as she entered the room. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." It was the first time in months that she had spoken to me with anything approaching warmth, and I found myself wondering if this was strategy or genuine regret. "Cassandra," I replied neutrally. Blackwood had regained his professional composure since the disastrous deposition, but I could see the strain around his eyes. This wasn't the case he had expected to handle, and his reputation was probably taking a hit with his high-profile client. "Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Pierce," he began formally, "we're here today because both parties recognize that a lengthy court battle would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially damaging to everyone involved." Margaret nodded politely. "We're prepared to listen to any reasonable proposal." "Thank you." Blackwood opened a folder and removed several documents. "After careful consideration of the unique circumstances surrounding the Pierce family assets, my client is prepared to accept a settlement significantly lower than what might typically be expected in a case involving this level of wealth." He paused dramatically, clearly expecting us to ask for details. When neither Margaret nor I responded, he continued. "Mrs. Pierce is willing to accept a settlement of $50 million, plus the penthouse apartment, plus spousal support of $200,000 per month for 10 years. I did quick math in my head. The total package was worth approximately $75 million, a fortune by any normal standard, but barely a fraction of what Cassandra had originally expected. Margaret made notes on her legal pad without changing expression. And in return, Mrs. Pierce would waive all claims to any other assets, would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement regarding the family's financial affairs, and would agree to an uncontested divorce. "I see." Margaret looked at me, and I could read the question in her eyes. We had discussed various settlement scenarios, but this was far more generous than anything we had anticipated offering. "Cassandra," I said, addressing her directly for the first time, "may I ask why you're willing to accept so much less than what you originally sought?" She looked uncomfortable, glancing at Blackwood before answering. I realized that the situation is more complicated than I initially understood. I also realized that fighting this in court would be ugly for everyone. "That's very pragmatic of you. I'm not trying to be vindictive, Jonathan. I just want to move on with my life." There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't entirely her decision. I suspected that Blackwood had explained the realities of her position with brutal clarity, and that she was beginning to understand just how precarious her situation actually was. Margaret leaned forward. "Mr. Blackwood, you understand that my client doesn't personally own the assets you're referencing? The penthouse belongs to Mrs. Evelyn Pierce, not to Mr. Jonathan Pierce." "We understand that," Blackwood replied carefully, "but we also believe that Mrs. Evelyn Pierce might be willing to cooperate with a reasonable settlement in order to avoid prolonged litigation." It was a clever approach, I had to admit. Rather than trying to prove that I owned assets that clearly belonged to my mother, they were essentially asking her to pay them to go away. "I'll need to discuss this with my mother," I said. "Of course." We agreed to reconvene on Monday, giving me the weekend to consider their proposal. As we were leaving, Cassandra touched my arm gently. "Jonathan, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Margaret looked at me questioningly, but I nodded. It's fine. I'll meet you downstairs. When we were alone in the conference room, Cassandra seemed to collapse into herself, the confident facade dissolving into something more vulnerable and real. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm sorry for all of this. Which part are you sorry for, Cassandra? The divorce, or the fact that it didn't turn out the way you planned? She flinched at the harshness in my voice, but she didn't deny the implication. Both, I suppose. When did it change? I asked. When did our marriage become about money instead of love? She was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city below. I don't know. Maybe it was gradual. Maybe it was always there and I just didn't want to admit it. But you did love me once, didn't you? Yes, she said softly. I did love you. Maybe I still do in some way. Then why this? Why not try to work things out? She turned back to me, and I could see tears in her eyes. Because I realized that you were never really mine. Your first love was always your work, your companies, your empire. I was just an accessory. That's not true. Isn't it? When was the last time we had a real conversation about something other than your business? When was the last time you asked me what I wanted out of life? I opened my mouth to protest, but she held up a hand to stop me. I'm not saying it's entirely your fault. I could have demanded more attention, more involvement in your life. But it was easier to just enjoy the lifestyle and pretend that was enough. And now I realize that I need to build something of my own. I can't spend the rest of my life being someone's wife and nothing else. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, and I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected. Respect for her self-awareness, even if it came too late to save our marriage. Cassandra, if you want to build something of your own, I'll help you. Not because of a divorce settlement, but because I want you to be happy. Why would you do that? Because despite everything that's happened, we had 12 years together. Some of them were good years. That has to count for something. She wiped her eyes carefully, trying not to smudge her makeup. Thank you. That means more to me than you know. That weekend, I drove out to the Hamptons to discuss the settlement proposal with my mother. I found her in the garden, despite the November chill, supervising the groundskeepers as they prepared the roses for winter. They want $75 million, I said without preamble. She didn't seem surprised. And what do you want to do? I'm not sure. It's a lot of money, but it would end this cleanly. Jonathan, sit down. She gestured to a wrought iron bench overlooking the water. I want to tell you something about your father that I've never told you before. I sat beside her, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. When Robert was diagnosed with cancer, we knew we didn't have much time left. One day, he said something to me that I've never forgotten. He said, "Evelyn, money is just paper. The only thing that matters is how we treat people and how we'll be remembered." She paused, watching the waves crash against the shore. If we pay Cassandra $75 million to go away quietly, what does that say about us? What does it say about the value of truth, of integrity, of standing up for what's right? It says we can afford to buy peace. And is that the lesson you want to learn from this experience? That problems can be solved by writing checks. I considered her question carefully. What's the alternative? We offer her what she's actually entitled to under the law, nothing, since you don't own any marital assets. We wish her well, we help her transition to independence in reasonable ways, but we don't reward her for trying to take what was never hers to begin with. She'll probably fight it in court. Then we'll fight back. And we'll win, because the truth is on our side. It will be public. Messy. Expensive. Yes, it will. But sometimes standing up for what's right is messy and expensive. That evening, I called Margaret from my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the trophies and memories of a simpler time. I want to make a counteroffer, I said. What did you have in mind? $1 million, plus I'll help her start her event planning business with a no-interest loan of up to $500,000 to be repaid over 10 years. She keeps her personal belongings and jewelry. No spousal support, no claim on any real estate or business assets. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Jonathan, that's extremely generous given that you're not legally required to give her anything. It's the right thing to do. She gave me 12 years of her life, even if it didn't end well. And if she rejects the offer? Then we go to trial and let a judge decide. Understood. I'll present the offer on Monday. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, I felt like I was acting with integrity rather than just reacting to events. Whatever happened next, I could face it with a clear conscience. 7. Blackwood's response to our counteroffer was swift and predictably negative. $1 million is insulting, he'd said during the brief conference call. We'll see you in court. And so, on a cold Monday morning in January, 12 years after Cassandra and I had promised to love each other until death do us part, we found ourselves sitting on opposite sides of a courtroom, preparing to let a stranger decide the value of our marriage. Judge Patricia Hendricks was a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s who had built a reputation for fairness and impatience with theatrical legal maneuvering. She'd been handling high-stakes divorce cases for over 20 years, and her expression suggested she'd seen every trick in the book. "This is Pierce versus Pierce," she announced as the court came to order. "I've reviewed the preliminary filings, and I understand this case involves some unusual circumstances regarding asset ownership. Mr. Blackwood, you're representing the petitioner?" "Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Cassandra Pierce is seeking an equitable distribution of marital assets accumulated during 12 years of marriage to Mr. Jonathan Pierce." "And Mr. Pierce is represented by Ms. Chun?" "Yes, Your Honor," Margaret replied, rising briefly. "We'll be demonstrating that Mr. Pierce owns no significant marital assets subject to distribution." Judge Hendricks frowned. "No significant assets? Mr. Pierce founded Pierce Industries, did he not?" "He did, Your Honor, but he doesn't own it." "I see. This should be interesting. Mr. Blackwood, call your first witness." Blackwood's strategy quickly became apparent. Rather than trying to prove that I owned assets I clearly didn't, he was going to argue that the entire arrangement with my mother was a fraudulent scheme designed to hide marital property. His first witness was Dr. Robert Morrison, a forensic accountant who had spent 3 weeks analyzing Pierce Industries' corporate structure. Dr. Morrison was a thin, precise man who spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to explaining complex financial concepts to juries. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Morrison testified, "the arrangement between Mr. Pierce and his mother is highly unusual and raises several red flags that suggest potential fraud." "What kind of red flags?" Blackwood asked. "First, it's extremely uncommon for a successful entrepreneur to legally own no stake in his own company. Second, the timing of various asset transfers coincides with major business successes, suggesting possible tax avoidance motivations. Third, Mr. Pierce exercises de facto control over assets he doesn't legally own." Margaret's cross-examination was masterful. She walked Dr. Morrison through the documentation step by step, forcing him to admit that every transfer had been properly executed, that all taxes had been paid, and that there was no evidence of illegal activity. "Dr. Morrison," she said, "is it illegal for a mother to own assets that benefit her son?" "No, it's not illegal." "Is it illegal for a successful businesswoman to make strategic investments?" "No." "Is it illegal for family members to share resources?" "No." "Then what, exactly, is fraudulent about this arrangement?" Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "It's not necessarily fraudulent, but it's unusual." "Unusual is not illegal, is it, Doctor?" "No, it's not." Blackwood's second witness was supposed to be his ace in the hole. James Riley, former Pierce Industries CFO who had left the company acrimoniously 2 years earlier after being passed over for promotion to president. Riley took the stand with obvious relish, clearly enjoying his moment of revenge. He was a small, bitter man who had always resented my success and blamed his own failures on office politics. "Mr. Riley," Blackwood began, "during your 8 years at Pierce Industries, did you observe the relationship between Mr. Pierce and his mother regarding business decisions?" "Oh, absolutely. Jonathan controlled everything. His mother was just a figurehead." "Can you give us specific examples?" "Sure. Jonathan made all the major acquisition decisions, personally negotiated the pharmaceutical deal with Hoffman Industries, and decided to expand into renewable energy. His mother just signed whatever papers he put in front of her." It was a damaging testimony, and I could see some of the courtroom observers nodding in agreement. But Margaret was ready. "Mr. Riley," she said during cross-examination, "you were terminated from Pierce Industries, weren't you?" "I resigned. Actually, let me rephrase that. You were asked to resign after it was discovered that you had been embezzling company funds, correct? Riley's face flushed red. That's not true. I was never charged with anything. Margaret approached the witness stand with a folder. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Defense Exhibit A, which is a report from the accounting firm of Deloitte and Touche detailing Mr. Riley's misappropriation of company resources. Objection. Blackwood rose quickly. This is irrelevant to the current proceedings. Overruled, Judge Hendricks said. The witness's credibility is certainly relevant. Please continue, Ms. Chun. Margaret proceeded to systematically destroy Riley's credibility, revealing not only the embezzlement, but also his history of making false accusations against former employers. By the time she was finished, Riley looked like exactly what he was, a disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind. Blackwood's case was falling apart, but he had one more card to play. On the second day of trial, he called Cassandra to the stand. She looked beautiful and vulnerable in a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back in a style that made her look younger and more innocent. As she was sworn in, I found myself remembering the woman I had fallen in love with before money and resentment had poisoned our relationship. Mrs. Pierce, Blackwood began gently, can you tell the court about your understanding of your husband's financial situation when you married him? I believe that Jonathan was a successful entrepreneur who owned a growing technology company. He lived like a wealthy man, expensive cars, luxury vacations, designer clothes. I had no reason to think he didn't own what he appeared to own. And how did this belief affect your decisions during the marriage? Cassandra dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I gave up my own career ambitions to support his success. I moved away from my family and friends in California. I put my own dreams on hold because I thought we were building something together. What were those dreams, Mrs. Pierce? I wanted to start my own event planning company. I had clients who were interested, investors who were ready to fund the business. But Jonathan needed me to travel with him, to entertain his clients, to be the perfect corporate wife. It was a compelling performance, and I could see that Judge Hendricks was listening intently. The narrative of the devoted wife, sacrificing her own ambitions for her husband's success, was a powerful one. Mrs. Pierce, when did you first learn that your husband didn't own the assets you thought he owned? During the deposition process. I was completely shocked. I felt betrayed and deceived. And how has this revelation affected you? I realize now that I've wasted 12 years of my life. I could have built my own career, my own wealth, my own independence. Instead, I trusted someone who wasn't honest with me. Margaret's cross-examination was careful but thorough. She couldn't attack Cassandra too aggressively without appearing to bully her, but she needed to expose the contradictions in her testimony. Mrs. Pierce, you testified that you gave up your career to support your husband's success. But isn't it true that you never actually started the event planning business you claim you wanted to pursue? I was planning to, but before you met your husband, you were working as an event coordinator, not running your own business, correct? Well, yes, but I had plans. And those plans never materialized into action, even during the early years of your marriage when your husband traveled less frequently. Cassandra looked uncomfortable. I was busy with other things. What other things? I was adjusting to married life, supporting Jonathan's career. Mrs. Pierce, isn't it true that you enjoyed the lifestyle your husband's apparent wealth provided? What do you mean? Margaret approached the witness stand with a folder. I have here credit card statements showing that during your marriage, you spent an average of $45,000 per month on personal expenses. Designer clothing, jewelry, spa treatments, shopping trips to Europe. Does that sound accurate? I suppose so. And you never questioned where the money was coming from. Jonathan told me we could afford it. So you were content to spend lavishly as long as the money was available. But now that you're divorcing, you want to claim you were deceived about its source? That's not fair. I had a right to know the truth about our finances. Did you ever ask to see financial statements? Did you ever request to be involved in investment decisions? Did you ever ask to understand the corporate structure of your husband's business? Cassandra was clearly struggling now. I trusted him to handle those things. So you were happy to enjoy the benefits of wealth without taking responsibility for understanding where it came from. Objection, Blackwood called out. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Hendricks replied. Ms. Chun, please rephrase. Mrs. Pierce, during your 12-year marriage, did you contribute financially to the household in any significant way? I managed our social obligations. I entertained clients. Did you earn income? No. So your contribution to the marriage was primarily as a social companion and hostess? Cassandra's voice was barely above a whisper. I was his wife. Yes, you were. And in exchange for being his wife, you lived in luxury for 12 years. Would you say that was fair compensation? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cassandra looked at Blackwood desperately, but there was no good answer to give. When Margaret was finished, Cassandra stepped down from the witness stand looking defeated and embarrassed. I almost felt sorry for her. The third day of trial belonged to the defense. Margaret's first witness was my mother, who took the stand with the same quiet dignity she had shown during her deposition. Mrs. Pierce, Margaret began, can you explain to the court why you chose to structure your son's business interests in your name? My mother spoke directly to Judge Hendricks, ignoring the lawyers and spectators. Your Honor, I lost my husband when my son was still a teenager. That experience taught me that success can be fragile and that people's true nature often emerges only when money is involved. I wanted to protect Jonathan from the kind of people who would love him for his wealth rather than his character. And has this arrangement served that purpose? Unfortunately, yes. This very proceeding proves that my concerns were justified. Margaret then called a series of witnesses who testified to my mother's business acumen and independence. Her investment advisor, who confirmed that she made her own financial decisions. The president of Pierce Industries, who testified that while I managed day-to-day operations, major strategic decisions required my mother's approval. And even our family's longtime accountant, who explained the legitimate business and estate planning reasons for the current structure. But the most powerful testimony came from my mother's longtime friend and bridge partner, Eleanor Whitman, who had known our family for 30 years. I've watched Evelyn Pierce make financial decisions for 3 decades, Mrs. Whitman testified. She's one of the shrewdest investors I've ever known. The idea that she's some kind of puppet being manipulated by Jonathan is laughable. If anything, he learned his business sense from her. Can you give us an example? Margaret asked. Certainly. 5 years ago, Evelyn told me she was considering investing in a small biotech company that was developing cancer treatments. Jonathan thought it was too risky and advised against it. Evelyn invested anyway, and that company was eventually acquired by Pfizer for 10 times what she paid for it. The testimony was devastating to Blackwood's case. If my mother was making independent investment decisions that contradicted my recommendations, it was impossible to argue that she was just a front for my assets. Finally, Margaret called me to the stand. Mr. Pierce, do you control your mother's financial decisions? Absolutely not. My mother is one of the most independent people I've ever known. She asks for my opinion sometimes, but she makes her own choices. Do you consider yourself wealthy? I thought about the question carefully. I live comfortably because of my mother's generosity, but I don't own significant assets in my own name. If your mother decided tomorrow to cut off your access to her wealth, what would happen to you financially? I would have to live on my salary and the modest assets I do own. It would be a significant lifestyle change, but I would manage. Mr. Pierce, why didn't you tell your wife about this arrangement when you married her? Because the whole point was to marry someone who loved me for who I am, not what I could provide. If I had revealed the full extent of my mother's wealth, I would never have known whether Cassandra's feelings for me were genuine. And now you know? I looked across the courtroom at Cassandra, who was staring down at her hands. Now I know. Blackwood's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to paint me as a manipulative liar who had deceived his wife, but every question he asked allowed me to explain the logic and legitimate purposes behind the arrangement. Mr. Pierce, don't you think your wife had a right to know the truth about your financial situation? She knew I lived comfortably, and that money wasn't a concern for us. The specific legal ownership of assets didn't affect her daily life, but it affects her rights in a divorce. Only if she married me for financial gain rather than love. It was a risky answer, but it was honest, and I could see Judge Hendricks nodding slightly. The closing arguments were predictable. Blackwood argued that the arrangement was a fraudulent scheme designed to cheat innocent spouses out of their marital rights. Margaret argued that my mother was an independent businesswoman who had every right to structure her assets as she saw fit, and that Cassandra had been compensated generously for her role as my wife through 12 years of luxury living. Judge Hendricks recessed for 2 hours to consider her decision. When court reconvened, the tension in the room was palpable. "I've considered the evidence and arguments presented by both sides," she began. "This is certainly one of the most unusual cases I've encountered, but the law is clear on several key points. First, there is no evidence that the arrangement between Mr. Pierce and his mother constitutes fraud or illegal asset concealment. The transfers were properly documented, all taxes were paid, and the structure serves legitimate business and estate planning purposes. Second, regardless of whether this arrangement is unusual or even unfair, the fact remains that Mr. Pierce does not legally own the assets in question. I cannot award Mrs. Pierce property that belongs to someone else. Third, while I have sympathy for Mrs. Pierce's position, the evidence suggests that she lived extraordinarily well during this marriage and received significant benefits in exchange for her companionship and social support. Therefore, I am awarding Mrs. Pierce the sum of $500,000 from Mr. Pierce's personal assets, plus her personal belongings and jewelry acquired during the marriage. I am also ordering Mr. Pierce to pay her attorney fees up to $100,000. Mrs. Pierce's request for spousal support is denied, as she is a healthy woman of working age who can support herself. Her requests for real estate and business assets are denied, as Mr. Pierce does not own these assets. This court is dissolved. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the room like a gunshot. 12 years of marriage, months of litigation, and millions of dollars in legal fees had been reduced to a $600,000 settlement, less than what Cassandra probably spent on shopping in a typical year. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness as the courtroom emptied around us. Relief that the ordeal was over, sadness that it had come to this at all. Cassandra approached me as I was gathering my papers. Her face was pale, and she looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of what had just transpired. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I'm sorry. For all of it." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. Beneath the makeup and expensive clothes, I could see the woman I had once loved, the woman who had once laughed at my terrible jokes and believed in my dreams. "I'm sorry too," I said. "I'm sorry we couldn't find a way to make it work. Do you think we ever really had a chance?" It was a question I had been asking myself for months. "I think we had a chance, but we both made choices that led us away from each other instead of toward each other." She nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I did love you, you know. In the beginning. I know. I loved you too. Will you still help me with the business? Like you offered?" I thought about my mother's words about how we treat people and how we'll be remembered. "Yes. When you're ready to start your event planning company, call me." I meant what I said. "Thank you." She walked away then, her heels clicking on the marble floor of the courthouse, carrying herself with as much dignity as she could muster. I watched her go and felt a chapter of my life closing forever. Margaret approached me, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes kind. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," I said. "And free." The judge made the right decision. Blackwood overplayed his hand. "Margaret, I want to ask you something. Do you think I was wrong not to tell Cassandra about the arrangement from the beginning?" She considered the question carefully. "That's not a legal question, Jonathan. That's a moral one. But I will say this, you gave her 12 years of a life most people can only dream of. She had every opportunity to build something of her own, to contribute to the marriage in meaningful ways, to create her own identity. Instead, she chose to be a passenger. That's not your fault." Outside the courthouse, I found my mother waiting by her car, having avoided the media circus that was already forming around the building. Several reporters had apparently gotten wind of the billionaire hiding assets story and were disappointed to learn it was more complicated than their headlines suggested. "How do you feel?" she asked as we drove away from downtown. "Relieved. Sad. Grateful. Grateful. Grateful that I had you looking out for me all these years. Grateful that you were wise enough to see what I couldn't see. Grateful that when it mattered most, I learned the difference between people who love me and people who love what I can provide." She reached over and squeezed my hand. What will you do now? I think I need to take some time to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to prove something to someone else. Maybe travel a little, read some books, remember what I used to dream about before building an empire became my only goal. And after that, maybe I'll find someone who loves me for who I am, not what I own. Someone who wants to build something together instead of taking what's already been built. She's out there, the right person. How can you be so sure? My mother smiled, and for a moment she looked decades younger. Because you're a good man, Jonathan. You're honest, you're hardworking, you're loyal, and you treat people with kindness. Those qualities will attract the right kind of person when you're ready. That evening, I stood alone in the penthouse that would soon no longer be my home. My mother had offered to let me stay, but I needed to start fresh, to build a life that was genuinely mine. I had already put a deposit on a modest apartment in Brooklyn Heights. 2 bedrooms, a view of the harbor, rent I could afford on my actual salary. As I packed my personal belongings, I came across our wedding album. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages, looking at pictures of 2 people who had genuinely believed they would grow old together. There was Cassandra in her wedding dress, radiant and hopeful. There was me, proud and optimistic, thinking I had found my partner for life. There were our families, our friends, all celebrating what they thought was the beginning of a great love story. Maybe it had been for a while. Maybe the fact that it ended badly didn't negate the good years we'd had together. Maybe loving someone and losing them was still better than never loving at all. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Pierce, this is Sarah Chun, Margaret's niece. She said you might be interested in meeting someone who runs a small nonprofit dedicated to helping women start businesses. No pressure, just coffee if you're interested. She seems lovely, and she definitely doesn't know about your family situation. S. I stared at the message for a long time, then typed back. Thank you for thinking of me, but I think I need some time to figure out who I am when I'm not married. Maybe in a few months. The response came quickly. Of course. The offer stands whenever you're ready. I set the phone aside and returned to packing. There would be time for new relationships later, time for new dreams and new possibilities. For now, I needed to learn how to be Jonathan Pierce. Not Jonathan Pierce the billionaire's son, not Jonathan Pierce the husband, just Jonathan Pierce the man. 8. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was living a life I barely recognized. The apartment in Brooklyn Heights had become home in a way the Central Park penthouse never had. I cooked my own meals, did my own laundry, and took the subway to work like millions of other New Yorkers. The change in perspective was profound. For the first time in years, I noticed things. The way sunlight fell through my kitchen window in the morning, the sound of children playing in the courtyard below, the satisfaction of solving problems with my own hands rather than delegating them to others. I had also stepped back from day-to-day management of Pierce Industries, promoting my longtime vice president, Maria Santos, to president while I remained as chairman of the board. The transition had gone smoothly, partly because Maria was exceptionally capable, and partly because my mother had endorsed the change enthusiastically. You've been running on adrenaline and ambition for 20 years, she had told me when I explained my decision. It's time to figure out what you actually enjoy doing. What I discovered was that I enjoyed teaching. I had started volunteering at a community college in Queens, helping adult students learn basic business skills. Many of them were immigrants working multiple jobs, trying to improve their situations through education and entrepreneurship. Their determination and optimism reminded me of why I had started Pierce Industries in the first place. Not to build an empire, but to solve problems and create value. One of my students was a woman named Elena Vasquez, who had fled domestic violence in Guatemala with her 2 young children. She was taking business classes at night while working as a hotel housekeeper during the day, hoping to eventually start a cleaning service that would employ other immigrant women. Mr. Pierce, she had asked me after class one evening, do you really think someone like me can build a successful business in America? Elena, I think someone with your work ethic and determination can accomplish anything they set their mind to. The question isn't whether you can succeed, it's what kind of success you want to build. It was a conversation that stayed with me long after class ended, partly because it reminded me of my mother's wisdom about the difference between being successful and being significant. The media attention from the divorce had died down relatively quickly, especially after it became clear that the story was less scandalous than initially hoped. A few business publications had written thoughtful pieces about family wealth management and the challenges of high-net-worth divorces, but most people had moved on to other gossip. Cassandra had moved to Los Angeles and, to my surprise, had actually started the event planning business she had talked about for years. According to mutual friends, she was working 16-hour days, rebuilding her life from scratch and discovering talents she never knew she had. I was genuinely happy for her, and I'd kept my promise to help with startup capital when she called 6 months earlier. "I don't deserve your help," she had said during that awkward phone conversation. "This isn't about deserving," I'd replied. "This is about giving you the chance to build something of your own." The loan was being repaid ahead of schedule, and her business was apparently thriving. Perhaps losing everything she thought she wanted had forced her to discover what she actually needed: purpose, independence, and self-respect. I was thinking about these changes in my life as I walked through Central Park on a Saturday morning in September, heading to meet someone I had been curious about for months. Sarah Chen had continued to send occasional messages, never pushy, just friendly updates about her Aunt Margaret's recovery from knee surgery or interesting articles about social entrepreneurship. Finally, 3 weeks earlier, I had texted back, "I think I'm ready for that coffee now." Her response had been immediate. "Wonderful." Her name is Kate Morrison. She runs the Foundation for Women's Economic Empowerment, and she has no idea who you are. Saturday, 10 a.m. at Joe Coffee on Waverly Place. Now, as I approached the small cafe in Greenwich Village, I felt nervous in a way I hadn't experienced since high school. This was my first real date since the divorce, my first chance to meet someone who knew nothing about my family history or business success. For the first time in my adult life, I would have to rely entirely on my personality and character to make a good impression. I spotted her immediately when I walked into the cafe. She was sitting by the window, reading a book and occasionally making notes in the margins. She had curly brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, wore no makeup that I could detect, and was dressed in jeans and a sweater that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. "Kate," I said, approaching her table. She looked up and smiled, and something in her expression, genuine warmth without calculation, immediately put me at ease. "Jonathan, Sarah said you were tall, but she didn't mention you were this tall." She stood to shake my hand, and I noticed that she was probably 5'6" to my 6'2". "Please sit down." I ordered for myself already, but the barista said to let her know when you arrived. I ordered a simple coffee and returned to the table, where Kate had already resumed the easy confidence that suggested she was comfortable with herself and her surroundings. "So," she said, closing her book and giving me her full attention, "Sarah tells me you're in business, but didn't specify what kind. Are you one of those mysterious entrepreneurs who can't talk about their work, or are you just modest?" I laughed, appreciating her directness. "I'm in technology, mostly boring corporate consulting and systems integration. What about you?" Sarah mentioned something about helping women start businesses. Her face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm I recognized from people who had found their calling. "I run a nonprofit that provides microloans and business training to women in underserved communities. Most of our clients are single mothers, recent immigrants, women transitioning out of difficult situations, people who have great ideas and strong work ethics but no access to traditional financing." That sounds incredibly rewarding. It is, but it's also heartbreaking sometimes. You see so much potential being wasted because people don't have the right opportunities or support systems. We talked for over 2 hours, and I found myself more engaged in conversation than I had been in years. Kate was passionate about her work, articulate about social issues, and possessed the kind of practical intelligence that came from actually implementing solutions rather than just talking about problems. "Can I ask you something?" she said as we were getting ready to leave. "Of course. This might sound strange, but you seem different from most of the men I meet in New York. More grounded, I guess. Less concerned with impressing me. Is that good or bad?" "It's refreshing. Most guys spend the first date trying to prove how successful they are or how much money they make. You haven't mentioned either." I felt a moment of panic, wondering if I should reveal more about my situation, but then decided that her observation was exactly why the coffee date was going so well. Maybe I'm more interested in learning about you than talking about myself. Well, mission accomplished. I feel thoroughly interviewed. She smiled as she said it, taking any sting out of the words. But fair is fair. Next time, I get to ask the questions. Next time? Are you interested in next time? I didn't hesitate. Very interested. Good. There's a street fair in Brooklyn next weekend that benefits local small businesses. Want to come with me? It's part business, part pleasure. I try to scout for potential clients, but the food trucks are amazing. I'd love to. As I walked home across the Brooklyn Bridge that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not hope for building something bigger or achieving some new level of success, but hope for simple human connection with someone who seemed to value the same things I was learning to value. That evening, I called my mother to tell her about the date. She sounds lovely, she said after I'd described the morning. And she has no idea about our situation? None. She thinks I'm a middle management tech consultant who lives in Brooklyn Heights. Which is essentially true, isn't it? I suppose it is. Jonathan, I want to tell you something. Watching you these past few months, seeing you discover who you are. When you're not trying to prove anything to anyone, it's been one of the greatest joys of my life. Really, you're becoming the man I always hoped you'd be, not just the successful businessman everyone expected you to become. The following Saturday, Kate picked me up at my apartment in her 10-year-old Honda Civic, apologizing for the cluttered interior and explaining that she used the car to transport supplies for her nonprofit. This is perfect, I said, settling into the passenger seat and meaning it. After years of luxury cars and professional drivers, there was something wonderfully normal about riding in a car with coffee-stained seats and nonprofit flyers scattered across the dashboard. The street fair was everything Kate had promised. Dozens of small vendors selling everything from handmade jewelry to ethnic food, live music from local bands, and families enjoying a beautiful autumn day. Kate moved through the crowds like someone who belonged, stopping to chat with vendors, asking about their businesses, and occasionally introducing me to women who might be good candidates for her loan program. "This is Maria," she said, leading me to a booth where a middle-aged Latina woman was selling elaborate cakes and pastries. She's one of our success stories. 3 years ago, she was working in a factory. Now she employs 6 people. Maria beamed with pride as she explained how she had used a $5,000 microloan to buy commercial baking equipment and rent kitchen space. "Miss Kate, she believed in me when nobody else would," she said in accented English. "Now my daughter, she goes to college because of the business." As we walked away from Maria's booth, Kate was quiet for a few minutes. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I was just thinking about something my father used to say. He immigrated from Ireland in the 1960s with nothing but a suitcase and a willingness to work. He used to tell me that America's greatest strength wasn't its wealth or power, but its ability to let people reinvent themselves. Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. He died when I was in college, but I think about him every day when I'm doing this work. She paused at a bench overlooking the East River. "Can I ask you something personal?" My heart rate increased slightly. "Sure. You seem to really understand what it's like to start over, to build something from nothing. Have you been through something difficult recently?" It was the perfect opening to tell her about the divorce, about my complicated family situation, about the unusual circumstances that had led me to this simplified life. But something held me back, not deception, but a desire to preserve this space where I could just be Jonathan the person rather than Jonathan the story. "I went through a divorce recently," I said finally. "It made me reassess a lot of things about what I thought I wanted out of life." "I'm sorry. That must have been hard." But it was also clarifying. Sometimes losing something you thought you wanted helps you figure out what you actually need. She nodded thoughtfully. "I've never been married, but I imagine it's like any other major life change, scary and liberating at the same time." Exactly. We spent the rest of the afternoon wandering through the fair, sampling food from different vendors, listening to music, and talking about everything from books to travel to our favorite childhood memories. By the time Kate dropped me off at my apartment that evening, I knew I was falling for her in a way that felt entirely different from anything I had experienced before. This wasn't the intense, passionate attraction I had felt for Cassandra, driven by chemistry and mutual ambition. This was something deeper and more sustainable, a connection based on shared values, compatible personalities, and genuine mutual respect. "I had a wonderful time today," she said as we sat in her car outside my building. "So did I. Thank you for including me in your world." Well, get ready for more. Next week is our annual fundraising gala. It's not fancy. We rent a community center and ask people to donate what they can. But if you're free Friday night, I'd love to have you there. I'll be there. As I walked up to my apartment, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was excited about the future not because of what I might achieve, but because of who I might become and who I might become it with. The fundraising gala was exactly what Kate had described. A simple event in a community center decorated with balloons and handmade signs. But the energy in the room was infectious. Women who had started businesses with Kate's help shared their stories. Local politicians praised the foundation's work, and everyone seemed genuinely invested in making a difference in their community. I watched Kate work the room with natural grace, equally comfortable talking to a city councilwoman as she was chatting with one of her loan recipients. She had changed out of her usual jeans and sweater into a simple black dress that somehow made her look both professional and approachable. During her speech to the gathered crowd, she talked about the foundation's mission with the kind of passionate eloquence that comes from deep personal conviction. "We believe that everyone deserves a chance to build something meaningful," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room. "Not everyone needs to become rich or famous to make a difference. Sometimes the most important success stories happen one family, one business, one dream at a time." As I listened to her speak, I thought about my own journey from empire builder to someone who was learning to find meaning in smaller, more personal achievements. Kate was describing exactly the kind of success I was beginning to understand and value. After the event, as we were helping to clean up, Kate introduced me to her board of directors. A mix of local business owners, community leaders, and retired professionals who volunteered their time because they believed in the mission. "Jonathan's been helping me scout potential clients," she explained to Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired banker who served as the foundation's treasurer. "He has a good eye for identifying women who are ready to take the next step." "What's your background?" Dr. Williams asked me. "I've been involved in business development and growth strategies," I said, which was technically true. "I'm interested in finding ways to help people build sustainable enterprises." "Well, we can always use more volunteers with business experience." Kate works too hard trying to do everything herself. As we drove back to my apartment that night, Kate was unusually quiet. "Everything okay?" I asked. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she said finally. "What do you mean?" "You're too good to be true. You're attractive, intelligent. You seem to genuinely care about the work I do. You volunteer with adult education programs. You're kind to waiters and vendors and everyone else we've met. In my experience, men like that are either taken or have some major flaw I haven't discovered yet." I laughed, both flattered and nervous. Maybe I'm just a genuinely decent guy who's been lucky enough to meet a genuinely decent woman. Maybe. She pulled up in front of my building and turned to face me. "Jonathan, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course. Are you hiding anything from me? Anything important?" The question hung between us like a test. This was the moment to tell her about my family, about the billions of dollars that were technically available to me, about the divorce trial that had made business news 6 months earlier. But looking at her face in the dim light from the street lamps, I realized that what she was really asking wasn't about money or assets or corporate structures. She was asking whether I was someone she could trust with her heart. "I'm not hiding anything about who I am," I said carefully. "I'm exactly the person you've gotten to know over these past few weeks." She studied my face for a long moment, then smiled. "Good. Because I'm starting to care about that person quite a bit." "Just starting to?" "Okay, more than starting to." She leaned across the center console and kissed me, and in that moment, sitting in her cluttered Honda outside my modest apartment building, I felt richer than I ever had in the Central Park penthouse. 9. 2 years later, I was standing in the garden of my mother's estate, watching Kate direct the setup for our wedding reception with the kind of efficient organization that made her so effective at her nonprofit work. She had insisted on a simple ceremony, family and close friends only, followed by a reception that would be elegant but not ostentatious. "The flowers go on the tables closest to the dance floor," she was telling the florist, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail despite the fact that she would be walking down the aisle in 3 hours. "And please make sure the caterers know that Mrs. Hendricks is vegetarian. She's Jonathan's old teacher, and I want her to feel completely welcome." Mrs. Henderson, my mother's housekeeper, approached with a concerned expression. "Miss Kate, shouldn't you be getting ready? The hair stylist has been waiting for 20 minutes. "I will, I just need to make sure everything is perfect." I walked over and gently took Kate's hands in mine. "Everything is already perfect. Go get beautiful, and let other people handle the details." She smiled and kissed me quickly. "I love you. I love you too. Now go." As I watched her hurry toward the house, I marveled at how completely my life had transformed. The man who had once measured success in quarterly earnings and market share now found his greatest satisfaction in Kate's laughter, in the thank you letters from women who had started businesses with her foundation's help, and in the quiet moments we spent planning a future that was rich in purpose rather than just possessions. Kate had learned about my family's wealth gradually, piece by piece, as our relationship deepened, and it became impossible to hide the context of my life completely. The revelation had come 18 months earlier, during a conversation about wedding planning. "Jonathan," she had said one evening as we were discussing venues, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." My heart had started racing, sensing that this was a pivotal moment. "Your apartment is nice, but it's not expensive. You drive a 5-year-old Toyota. You buy your clothes at J.Crew. But somehow, you're offering to pay for a wedding at one of the most exclusive estates in the Hamptons, and you don't seem remotely concerned about the cost." I had taken a deep breath and told her everything, about my mother's wealth, about the divorce, about the careful structure we had built to protect both our assets and our relationships. I told her about Cassandra, about the trial, about the hard lessons I had learned about money and love. Kate had listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing the complexity of my situation. "So you're telling me," she had said finally, "that you're technically one of the richest people in America, but you choose to live like a middle-class guy in Brooklyn? That's a fair summary, yes. And you didn't tell me because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I could provide. Because I've learned that money changes everything, and I didn't want it to change us." She had been quiet for a long time, processing this information and its implications. "Kate, I understand if this changes things between us. I understand if you feel deceived or if you need time to think about what this means. Jonathan, can I ask you something? Anything. If all of this wealth disappeared tomorrow, if your mother decided to give it all away, if some financial disaster wiped it out, would you still be the same person I fell in love with?" "I'd like to think so. Would you still volunteer at the community college? Would you still care about Elena's business and Maria's success? Would you still want to spend Saturday mornings at street fairs and Friday nights at nonprofit fundraisers?" "Yes, absolutely. Then the money doesn't matter. What matters is who you choose to be and how you choose to live." That conversation had deepened our relationship in ways I hadn't thought possible. Kate understood that wealth could be either a tool for good or a corrupting influence, and she trusted me to use it wisely. More importantly, she helped me understand that my true worth had nothing to do with my bank account and everything to do with my character and choices. Now, as I stood in my mother's garden preparing to marry the woman who had helped me discover who I really was, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. My mother appeared beside me, elegant in a navy dress that complemented her silver hair. "Nervous?" she asked. "Excited. Happy. Grateful. But not nervous." "Good. That's how you should feel on your wedding day." We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the final preparations for the reception. Cassandra's empty chair from my first wedding seemed like it belonged to a different lifetime, a different person. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always. Do you think Dad would approve of Kate?" She was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Your father believed that the measure of a person wasn't what they accumulated, but what they gave away. He believed that the truest success came from making other people's lives better. Kate does both of those things naturally, without thinking about it, because that's who she is. She paused, watching as Kate emerged from the house in her wedding dress. Simple, elegant, perfect. Yes, she said finally. I think your father would not only approve of Kate, I think he would be proud of the man you've become because of her influence. The ceremony was everything Kate had wanted. Intimate, meaningful, and focused on the commitment we were making rather than the spectacle surrounding it. Judge Patricia Hendricks, who had presided over my divorce trial, had agreed to officiate, bringing a sense of poetic justice to the proceedings. Jonathan and Kate, she said as we exchanged vows, you've both learned that true partnership isn't about what you can take from each other, but what you can build together. May your marriage be a testament to the power of shared values, mutual respect, and genuine love. As Kate and I kissed to seal our marriage, I thought about the twisted path that had brought us together. If Cassandra hadn't demanded a divorce, if I hadn't been forced to confront the emptiness of my previous life, if I hadn't learned to value character over wealth, I never would have been ready for someone like Kate. During the reception, Elena Vasquez, my former student who had successfully built her cleaning service into a thriving business, approached me with tears in her eyes. Mr. Pierce, I want to thank you for everything you taught me. Elena, you did all the hard work yourself. No, you taught me something very important. You taught me that success isn't about how much money you make, it's about how many people you can help along the way. As the evening wound down and Kate and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon, a simple trip to Ireland to visit the village where her father had grown up, I found myself thinking about the different kinds of wealth I had accumulated over the years. There was my mother's fortune, built over decades and carefully preserved for future generations. There was Pierce Industries, a global corporation that employed thousands of people and generated billions in revenue. There were investments and properties and assets that could be counted and measured and reported on quarterly statements. But there was also Kate's laugh when she thought something was genuinely funny. There was the pride in Maria's voice when she talked about her daughter going to college. There was the satisfaction of helping Elena build something meaningful from nothing. There was my mother's approval and the knowledge that I had become the man my father would have wanted me to be. These two kinds of wealth weren't mutually exclusive, but they weren't the same thing either. One could be inherited or lost, given or taken away. The other had to be earned through choices and actions, relationships and character. As Kate and I drove away from the reception, she reached over and took my hand. Any regrets? She asked. About what? Giving up the penthouse lifestyle. Choosing to live like normal people instead of like billionaires. I thought about her question seriously. Kate, I've lived both ways, and I can tell you without hesitation that I'm happier now than I've ever been. Even though we'll probably never own a mansion or fly on private jets or buy whatever we want without thinking about the cost, especially because of that, those things didn't make me happy when I had them. What makes me happy is building something real with someone I love. She squeezed my hand. Good answer. As we drove through the quiet streets toward our home, a modest house in Park Slope that we had bought together with the money Kate had saved and a small contribution from my actual salary, I reflected on the irony of my situation. I was married to a woman who would probably never fully comprehend the extent of my family's wealth, but who loved me completely for the person I was when I didn't have access to that wealth. I had learned to find satisfaction in small successes and meaningful relationships rather than massive achievements and public recognition. Most importantly, I had discovered that the question wasn't whether money could buy happiness. It was whether happiness required money at all. And the answer I now knew was definitively no. My phone buzzed with a text message from Cassandra. Saw the wedding announcement in the Times. She looks perfect for you. Wishing you both every happiness. See. I showed the message to Kate, who read it and smiled. That was thoughtful of her. She's built a good life for herself in Los Angeles. Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is the best thing that can happen to you. Is that your philosophy now? No, I said, pulling into our driveway and looking at the woman who had taught me the difference between being rich and being wealthy. My philosophy now is that the best things in life aren't things at all. Kate laughed and kissed me as we sat in our ordinary car outside our ordinary house. planning an ordinary life that felt more extraordinary than anything I had ever dreamed possible. And as we walked up the steps to begin our marriage, I realized that I had finally learned the most important lesson my mother had been trying to teach me all along. The true measure of wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you're willing to give up for the people and principles that matter most. In the end, I had given up the appearance of wealth to find actual richness. I had surrendered the fantasy of empire to discover the reality of love. And I had learned that sometimes the greatest fortune you can inherit is the wisdom to know when you have enough. Cassandra wanted $5 billion and walked away with $600,000. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in discovering that I could be loved for exactly who I am, not what I could provide. Kate taught me that true wealth can't be inherited, stolen, or divided in a divorce. It has to be earned through the choices we make and the people we choose to love. If you enjoyed this journey from betrayal to redemption, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your heart and protecting your wealth?